In a sterile hospital room somewhere in occupied Europe during World War II, a surgeon lifts his scalpel to make the first incision on a wounded German officer. The blade glints under the surgical lamp, appearing perfectly clean, polished to a mirror shine. What the surgeon doesn't know, what no one in that operating theatre suspects, is that the instrument in his hand has been deliberately contaminated. The nurse who prepared it, a quiet woman in a white habit with a cross hanging from her neck, has just committed an act of biological warfare so subtle, so invisible, that it will take weeks before anyone realizes what's happening. By then, dozens of enemy soldiers will be writhing in agony, their wounds festering with infections that antibiotics can barely touch. This is not a story about a medical accident. This is not about negligence or poor wartime conditions. This is about a woman of God who turned her healing hands into weapons, who transformed the operating room into a battlefield, and who used the trust placed in her profession to wage a secret war that would save countless lives on one side, while condemning men on the other to excruciating deaths. Her name has been erased from history books. Her face appears in no war memorials. But what she did in those underground hospitals beneath occupied cities might be one of the most ethically complex acts of resistance in the entire war. The year is 1943, and across Nazi-occupied Europe, a network of hospitals operates in a strange twilight zone of wartime medicine. These facilities treat both occupying German forces and local civilian populations, often in the same buildings, sometimes even in adjacent rooms. The rules of medical neutrality, established by the Geneva Conventions, theoretically protect these spaces from becoming battlegrounds. Doctors and nurses are supposed to treat all patients equally, regardless of which uniform they wear or which flag they salute. In practice, this creates an impossible moral situation for healthcare workers who watch their countries burn while they're forced to save the lives of the men doing the burning. In Belgium, in France, in the Netherlands, in Poland, nurses and doctors face this dilemma every single day. They watch German officers receive the best care, the cleanest bandages, the most attention, while civilians in the next ward die from lack of supplies. They see soldiers recover from battlefield wounds only to return to the front lines to kill more of their countrymen. And in this pressure cooker of moral compromise, some healthcare workers begin to ask themselves a dangerous question. What if healing the enemy is the same as helping them win? Among these conflicted medical professionals, one group finds itself in an especially precarious position: nuns serving as nurses. In Catholic countries across occupied Europe, religious sisters have always formed the backbone of hospital staffing. They're trusted implicitly, seen as beyond reproach, their vows of service and compassion making them perfect caregivers. The occupying forces actually prefer them because nuns are perceived as apolitical, devoted only to God and mercy, incapable of deception or resistance. A nun in a hospital is invisible in the best possible way. She moves through wards without suspicion, handles instruments without oversight, prepares medications without supervision. She is, in the eyes of German military authorities, the least likely person to pose any threat whatsoever. This fundamental misunderstanding of what devotion to God might actually mean in the face of evil creates a perfect cover for resistance, because these women have taken vows, yes, but they've also taken a side. And some of them have decided that their duty to the innocent outweighs their duty to heal everyone equally. Sister Marie-André, though that's not her real name because her true identity was never recorded in any official resistance documents, works in a hospital in occupied Belgium that has been partially requisitioned by German military medical corps. She's in her early 30s, trained in nursing before the war at a Catholic teaching hospital in Brussels. Her days follow a brutal routine: morning prayers at 5, then 12 to 14 hours in the surgical ward, assisting with everything from battlefield amputations to emergency abdominal surgeries. She's good at her job, meticulous and calm under pressure, the kind of nurse that surgeons specifically request for difficult procedures. Her hands never shake, her focus never wavers. The German doctors praise her efficiency in their reports. They have no idea that this same steadiness, this same attention to detail, is being channeled toward a very different purpose. While she prepares surgical instruments in the sterilization room, while she organizes the tool trays, While she assists in operations, Sister Marie-André is making calculated decisions about which instruments will actually be sterilized properly and which will carry microscopic passengers into German bodies. The technique she uses is brilliant in its simplicity and nearly impossible to detect. Surgical instruments in 1943 are sterilized through boiling or in better equipped facilities through early autoclaves that use pressurized steam. The process takes time and follows strict protocols. But in the chaos of wartime hospitals where supplies are short and schedules are overwhelming, corners get cut. A tray of instruments might be pulled from the sterilizer a few minutes early. A scalpel might be wiped down and reused more quickly than proper protocol allows. In normal circumstances, these shortcuts might cause occasional infections, but nothing systematic, nothing that would raise suspicion. Sister Marie-André understands this. She understands that if German patients start developing infections at a slightly elevated rate, it will be blamed on wartime conditions, on overworked staff, on supply shortages, on bad luck. It won't be blamed on deliberate sabotage, especially not sabotage committed by a nun whose entire identity is built around caring for the sick. So she develops a system. For Belgian and French civilian patients, instruments are sterilized with obsessive care. For German military patients, instruments pass through a process that looks identical but isn't. Water that's a few degrees too cool. Steam pressure that's slightly too low. Timing that's cut just short enough to leave certain bacteria alive. The infections begin slowly, sporadically enough that no pattern is immediately obvious. A Wehrmacht lieutenant develops sepsis 3 days after a routine surgery to remove shrapnel from his shoulder. An SS officer's appendectomy wound turns necrotic despite aggressive treatment. A tank commander's leg amputation site becomes so infected that a second amputation is required, this time above the knee, leaving him permanently disabled and useless to the war effort. The German medical staff is puzzled, but not yet alarmed. Infection rates are always higher during wartime. Antibiotics are still relatively new and not always effective. The human body is fragile, and surgery is dangerous even in the best conditions. They adjust their protocols slightly, increase antibiotic dosages, pay more attention to post-operative care, but the infections continue because the source of the contamination isn't in their protocols or their post-operative care. The source is in the hands of a woman they trust completely, a woman whose habit and cross make her invisible to suspicion, a woman who has decided that her faith demands not universal compassion, but strategic mercy, that healing the oppressor is collaboration, and that the instruments of medicine can be transformed into instruments of resistance. The hospital where Sister Marie-André works sits in the heart of a Belgian city that has been under German occupation for 3 years by the time her campaign of invisible warfare begins. The building itself is a converted 19th century convent, its high ceilings and long corridors now filled with the smell of antiseptic and the sounds of suffering in multiple languages. The ground floor has been completely taken over by the German Military Medical Administration, with Nazi flags hanging in what used to be the chapel and Wehrmacht officers using the Mother Superior's old office for their command center. The upper floors remain technically under Belgian civilian control, but this division is mostly symbolic. German soldiers receive treatment wherever space is available, and Belgian staff are expected to serve them with the same dedication they show to their own countrymen. For most of the nurses and doctors, this arrangement is a source of constant moral anguish. They save German lives knowing those same men will return to brutalizing their country. They watch resources flow preferentially to enemy soldiers, while Belgian civilians wait longer for care. But they comply because the alternative is imprisonment or execution, because the occupation has taught everyone that resistance must be invisible or it must be suicidal. Sister Marie-André's transformation from healer to saboteur doesn't happen overnight. It begins 6 months earlier, during the winter of 1942, when she's assigned to assist with the amputation of a German corporal's frostbitten feet. The surgery is routine, the young soldier frightened and delirious with pain. She holds his hand while the anesthesia takes effect, whispers what comfort she can in her broken German, does everything a good nurse should do. 2 weeks later, after he's recovered and been discharged, She sees him again through the hospital window. He's in the courtyard below, walking stiffly on his new prosthetics, smoking a cigarette with other recovering soldiers. They're laughing about something, and then one of them makes a gesture, a pantomime of shooting, and they all laugh harder. She realizes with cold clarity that she has just helped repair a man who will go back to killing. Her skilled hands, her careful attention, her compassion, all of it has been weaponized against her own people. That night, during evening prayers in the small chapel the nuns are still allowed to use, she asks God for guidance and hears only silence. The silence, she decides, is its own answer. If God is silent in the face of this occupation, then perhaps human beings must make their own moral calculations. The decision to begin sabotaging sterilization procedures comes gradually, built on weeks of observation and planning. Sister Marie-Andrée spends her free time studying medical texts on infection and wound healing, materials she checks out from the hospital's medical library, under the pretense of improving her nursing knowledge. She learns about which bacteria are most dangerous, which survive heat exposure best, which cause the slowest and most debilitating infections. She learns that Staphylococcus and Streptococcus can survive in instruments that haven't been properly sterilized, that these organisms cause infections that look entirely natural, that even with antibiotics treatment is difficult and recovery is slow. She experiments carefully at first, allowing just 1 or 2 instruments per week to pass through inadequate sterilization, choosing surgeries where the patient is a confirmed combat soldier rather than support staff or administrative personnel. Her targeting is precise. She's not trying to kill every German who comes through the hospital. She's trying to remove combat-effective soldiers from the war, to turn killers into patients, to transform the hospital from a repair facility for the German war machine into a trap that swallows their fighters and spits out invalids. What makes her campaign sustainable is the perfect cover provided by her identity and the chaos of wartime medicine. Nuns in occupied Europe exist in a strange protected category. Their religious status makes them somewhat immune to casual brutality. German soldiers might slap a civilian or shoot a suspected partisan without hesitation, but most still hesitate to raise a hand against a woman in religious habit. The conditioning of Catholic upbringing, even among men who've abandoned their faith or serve a pagan ideology, creates a psychological barrier. Sister Marie-Andrée understands this protection and uses it ruthlessly. When German medical officers review infection rates, when they hold meetings to discuss the troubling pattern of post-operative complications, she sits in these meetings as part of the nursing staff. She nods along with their theories about contaminated water supplies or poor ventilation. She even suggests helpful improvements to their protocols, recommendations that sound reasonable, but actually do nothing to address the real source of contamination. She has learned that the best way to hide is to participate in the search. That active concern is the perfect mask for deliberate sabotage. By the spring of 1943, the infection rate for German military patients at her hospital has tripled compared to the previous year. 3 soldiers have died from sepsis. 17 have been invalided out of combat service permanently. Dozens more have spent weeks or months in recovery beds that could have been used for fresh wounded. The German medical administration knows something is wrong, but they're looking in all the wrong places. They blame Belgian civilian staff for incompetence, though they can't quite bring themselves to blame the nuns directly. They blame supply shortages and wartime conditions. They blame the Belgian resistance for possibly contaminating water supplies or air ducts, never imagining that the contamination is happening in the moment of care itself, that the woman holding the surgical tray is the weapon they're searching for. Sister Marie-Andrée watches their frustration with quiet satisfaction. Every infected wound is a small victory. Every soldier sent home disabled is one less killer on the battlefield. She's found a way to fight back that uses the enemy's own trust against them, that transforms her vocation into resistance, and she has no intention of stopping until the occupation ends or until they finally catch her. The mechanics of Sister Marie-Andrée's operation require an understanding of the hospital's daily rhythm that only comes from years of experience within its walls. Every morning at 6, she arrives at the sterilization room. a windowless chamber in the basement where surgical instruments are cleaned and prepared for the day's operations. The room contains 2 large sterilization units, older models that use boiling water and steam, and a newer German-imported autoclave that theoretically provides better results but breaks down constantly due to poor maintenance and unreliable electrical supply. Her job is to process the instruments used in yesterday's surgeries, inspect them for damage, and prepare sterile trays for today's scheduled operations. She works alone during these early hours, which is exactly what makes her sabotage possible. The German medical staff assumes that a nun performing routine sterilization work needs no supervision, that her religious vows and professional training make oversight unnecessary. They're correct about her training. She's meticulous and knowledgeable, but they fundamentally misunderstand what her vows actually demand of her in this moment of history. Her vow of service, she has decided, is to the innocent, not to the invader. Her vow of compassion extends to victims, not to those who create victims. The system she develops is elegantly simple and nearly impossible to detect without constant monitoring that no one has time or inclination to provide. Each morning, she sorts the instruments that need sterilization into 2 groups. The first group, instruments designated for civilian patients or for the small number of Allied prisoners who sometimes receive treatment at the hospital, goes through the full sterilization protocol. Water heated to 100 degrees Celsius, maintained at boiling for a full 30 minutes, then instruments dried and stored in sealed containers that prevent recontamination. The second group, instruments marked for use in surgeries on German military personnel, goes through a process that looks identical, but diverges in critical details. The water temperature reaches only 90 to 95 degrees, just below the threshold needed to kill hardy bacterial spores. The timing is cut to 20 or 25 minutes instead of 30. The drying process is rushed, allowing instruments to be stored while still slightly damp, creating conditions where surviving bacteria can actually multiply. To anyone observing casually, she appears to be following protocol perfectly. The instruments emerge from the sterilizer looking clean and shiny, but clean and sterile are not the same thing, and that gap between appearance and reality is where her warfare lives. The selection of which instruments to contaminate requires strategic thinking beyond simple opportunity. Sister Marie-Andre has learned through observation which types of surgeries are most critical to returning soldiers to combat and which infections will cause the most lasting damage without being immediately fatal. Scalpels used for deep tissue work, the kind required in removing embedded shrapnel or repairing battlefield injuries, become her primary vectors. Bone saws and surgical drills used in amputations receive special attention because infections in bone tissue are notoriously difficult to treat and often require additional amputations at higher levels. Suturing needles are left with microscopic contamination that introduces bacteria directly into closing wounds, creating infections that develop slowly and look like post-operative complications rather than sabotage. She avoids contaminating instruments used in immediately life-threatening emergency surgeries, not out of mercy, but out of tactical calculation. A soldier who dies on the operating table generates an autopsy and investigation. A soldier who survives surgery but develops a severe infection a week later generates only sympathy and medical treatment that drains resources while producing a permanently disabled veteran who becomes a burden on the German war economy. The psychological toll of this double life manifests in ways that Sister Marie-Andre never anticipated when she began her campaign. During the day, she maintains perfect composure, her face a mask of professional concern as she assists in surgeries on the very men she's attempting to disable. She holds retractors, passes instruments, mops blood from surgical fields, all while knowing that the tools she's providing carry invisible passengers that will transform healing into harm. She watches German surgeons work with genuine skill and dedication to save their soldiers, and she feels a complicated mixture of respect for their medical ability and satisfaction that their efforts will often be undermined by her sabotage. At night, alone in her small room in the convent section of the hospital, she prays not for forgiveness, but for strength to continue. She's learned to separate her actions from traditional concepts of sin and virtue, to see her sabotage as a form of protection rather than harm, to understand that in the moral mathematics of war, disabling one killer might save 10 innocents. But the separation is never complete. She still dreams sometimes of the soldiers whose infections she's caused, still wonders about their families waiting at home, still struggles with the knowledge that her faith tradition would condemn her actions even as her conscience insists they're necessary. By early summer of 1943, the cumulative impact of her months-long campaign has become statistically significant enough that the German Medical Command launches a formal investigation into the hospital's infection rates. A team of military doctors arrives from Berlin, armed with inspection checklists and statistical analyses that show her hospital's complication rates are nearly 4 times the average for occupied territory medical facilities. They interview staff, observe procedures, test water supplies, inspect storage areas and examine patient records going back 18 months. Sister Marie-André participates in every aspect of this investigation with apparent enthusiasm, answering questions thoroughly, demonstrating her sterilization procedures under direct observation, even suggesting additional tests they might conduct. She knows that when someone is watching, her technique is flawless. The contamination only happens in the unwatched moments, in the 5 seconds when she adjusts a temperature dial, in the quiet minute when she removes a tray slightly early, in the brief instant when she stores instruments before they're completely dry. The investigators find nothing conclusive. They note some equipment problems, recommend facility upgrades that will never be prioritized during wartime, and ultimately conclude that the elevated infection rates are likely due to the combination of old equipment, overworked staff, and the general degradation of medical conditions under occupation. Their report clears the hospital of deliberate sabotage. Sister Marie-André reads it with quiet relief and returns to work, knowing that she's bought herself more time to continue a war that no one knows she's fighting. The expansion of Sister Marie-André's resistance network begins not through deliberate recruitment, but through the quiet recognition that passes between people who share unspoken truths. In the fall of 1943, she notices that another nurse, a younger Belgian woman named Elise who works primarily in the recovery ward, has started paying unusual attention to which patients develop infections and which don't. Elise never says anything directly, never asks questions that would force a dangerous conversation, but Sister Marie-André catches her looking, sees the way her eyes track the pattern of suffering that divides German soldiers from civilian patients. One morning in the supply closet, Elise positions herself next to Sister Marie-André while organizing bandages and says quietly, almost casually, that she's noticed the German patients seem to have terrible luck with their recoveries. It's not a question, not an accusation, just an observation delivered in a tone that suggests she's commenting on the weather. Sister Marie-André pauses for only a fraction of a second before responding. That war creates many kinds of misfortune, that God's protection sometimes manifests in unexpected ways, that nurses can only do their best with the tools and conditions they're given. The conversation ends there, but a week later Elise begins deliberately delaying antibiotic administration to German patients, stretching the intervals between doses just enough to reduce effectiveness without creating obvious negligence. She never discusses this with Sister Marie-André. They never coordinate their efforts explicitly. But they've become collaborators in a resistance so subtle that it operates almost entirely through knowing glances and careful silence. The moral complexity of their actions deepens as the occupation grinds through its 4th year, and the character of German patients begins to shift. In the early days of Sister Marie-André's campaign, the soldiers passing through her hospital were primarily Wehrmacht regular army, young men conscripted into service who might have personal doubts about the war, even as they fought it. By 1944, the patients increasingly include SS troops, Gestapo officers recovering from partisan attacks, and members of special units whose specific duties are never mentioned, but whose presence brings a darker energy into the wards. These men are not reluctant soldiers. They're ideological warriors who speak casually about their work in terms that make even the German medical staff uncomfortable. Sister Marie-André finds her resolve strengthening in the face of these patients. When she prepares instruments for a surgery on an SS Hauptsturmführer whose shoulder was shattered during a raid on a resistance safehouse, she feels no moral conflict whatsoever. The contaminated scalpel that opens his wound carries not guilt, but righteousness. But there are other cases that test her certainty. A 19-year-old private from Bavaria, barely old enough to shave, comes in with severe frostbite from the Eastern Front. He cries for his mother during surgery, delirious with pain and fear. Sister Marie-André prepares the instruments for his operation according to her system, watches the infection develop in his amputated toes, sees him invalided home permanently with a shuffling walk that will mark him for life. She tells herself that this boy would have killed others if left capable of fighting, that individual mercy creates collective harm, that war forces impossible choices. But the boy's face appears in her prayers sometimes, mixed with all the other faces, and she understands that the cost of resistance is measured not just in enemy casualties, but in the pieces of herself that die with each act of calculated harm. The hospital's social ecosystem creates strange intimacies between occupiers and occupied that make the work of resistance psychologically exhausting in ways Sister Marie-André never anticipated. German doctors and Belgian nurses work side by side for 12-hour shifts, sharing coffee during brief breaks, discussing medical techniques, complaining about supply shortages that affect everyone regardless of nationality. Some of the German medical staff are genuinely skilled and dedicated physicians who happen to wear the wrong uniform, men who chose military medicine as an alternative to combat service, who save lives with the same commitment regardless of which flag the patient served. Dr. Hoffmann, the chief surgeon, is particularly difficult to hate. He's a grandfather from Munich who carries photographs of his family, who treats Belgian civilian patients with the same care as German soldiers, who has never shown the slightest indication of Nazi ideology in his work. He trusts Sister Marie-André completely, often requests her specifically for difficult surgeries because of her steady hands and unflappable demeanor. She assists him in operations where her contaminated instruments will later undo his skilled work, and she feels a strange, distant regret for betraying his professional trust, even as she remains absolutely committed to betraying his nation's war effort. The compartmentalization required to maintain these relationships while actively sabotaging their outcomes creates a kind of spiritual exhaustion that no amount of prayer seems to relieve. She's living multiple lives simultaneously, each one requiring a different version of truth, and the boundaries between them grow thinner with each passing month. The tactical evolution of her sabotage techniques accelerates as she gains confidence and as the war situation grows more desperate for the occupation forces. By the spring of 1944, with Allied invasion clearly imminent and German resources stretched catastrophically thin, Sister Marie-André begins taking greater risks with more aggressive contamination methods. She experiments with deliberately introducing soil particles into wound irrigation solutions, knowing that tetanus and gas gangrene bacteria thrive in such conditions and cause infections that spread rapidly and resist treatment. She discovers that surgical sponges stored in improperly sealed containers can harbor dangerous organisms, and she ensures that sponges used on German patients come from containers that have been subtly compromised. She learns to identify which patients are high-value targets, officers and specialists, whose loss will create disproportionate impact on German military effectiveness, and she reserves her most aggressive sabotage for these cases. A panzer commander who comes in for a relatively minor shrapnel wound leaves 6 weeks later, missing his entire leg below the knee, the victim of an infection that progressed so rapidly it shocked even the experienced surgical staff. A Luftwaffe navigator undergoes routine surgery to repair a broken collarbone and develops an infection that spreads to his blood, leaving him with permanent heart damage that ends his flying career. These aren't statistical casualties anymore. They're targeted eliminations, each one carefully calculated to remove specific capabilities from the German war machine. The psychological weight of maintaining her cover becomes particularly acute during moments when German patients express gratitude for her care. A young lieutenant whose infected leg wound she personally caused spends his final days in the hospital, thanking her repeatedly for her kindness, for the gentle way she changes his bandages, for the comfort she provides during his suffering. He gives her a small wooden cross he carved during his recovery, a gift meant to honor her devotion to healing, and she accepts it with a smile that feels like it might crack her face apart. She keeps the cross in her pocket during work shifts, a physical reminder of the profound irony at the heart of her double life. She's become expert at accepting thanks for care while knowing she's the source of harm, at maintaining expressions of concern while feeling satisfaction at her sabotage's success, at separating her performance of mercy from the reality of her warfare. The cross becomes a kind of talisman, not of faith, but of commitment to a cause that requires her to betray every surface expectation of her role. When she touches it during difficult moments, she's reminding herself that the discomfort she feels, the moral complexity that keeps her awake at night, is the price of meaningful resistance, and that price is one she's chosen to pay regardless of what it costs her soul. The arrival of D-Day in June 1944 transforms the atmosphere in the hospital from tense routine into barely controlled chaos, and with that chaos comes both opportunity and danger for Sister Marie-André's operation. German casualties flood in from the Western Front as Allied forces push inland from Normandy, overwhelming the facility's capacity and forcing medical staff to work 20-hour shifts with almost no rest. The surgical theatres run continuously, with operations scheduled in overlapping waves that leave no time for proper cleaning or sterilization between procedures. Under normal circumstances, this degradation of medical standards would horrify Sister Marie-André. But now it provides perfect cover for her sabotage to escalate dramatically. When sterilization protocols are already being compromised by necessity, her deliberate failures blend seamlessly into the general breakdown of proper procedure. She can contaminate instruments more aggressively, more frequently, with virtually no risk of detection, because everyone assumes that any resulting infections are simply inevitable consequences of wartime medical conditions. The infection rate for German patients climbs above 50% during the summer of 1944, a statistic so alarming that under any other circumstances it would trigger immediate investigation. But the German Medical Command is too overwhelmed managing casualties from two collapsing fronts to focus on anything except keeping soldiers alive long enough to send them back to combat. The moral calculus of Sister Marie-André's actions shifts as the war's outcome becomes increasingly certain, and the character of German resistance grows more desperate and vicious. The soldiers passing through her hospital now include members of units that have participated in massacres of Belgian civilians as the occupation tightens its grip in response to intensifying partisan activity. She treats men who wear the insignia of divisions responsible for atrocities in nearby villages, men who discuss their actions with casual brutality during their recovery periods, men who see Belgian suffering not as tragedy but as necessary security measures. For these patients, Sister Marie-André's sabotage becomes not just strategic but deeply personal. When she prepares instruments for surgery on an officer from a unit that executed 32 civilians in a reprisal action last month, her hands don't shake with guilt but with controlled fury. The infection she introduces isn't a tactical consideration anymore, it's justice delivered through biology, punishment administered with surgical precision. She's aware that this emotional dimension to her work is dangerous, that letting hatred drive her actions could lead to mistakes that expose her operation, but she also knows that the hatred is what sustains her through the exhaustion and moral complexity of her double life. Without it, she might collapse under the weight of what she's doing. The anger keeps her functional, keeps her focused, keeps her willing to continue a form of warfare that requires her to smile at men she's actively trying to destroy. The network of resistance within the hospital has grown beyond Sister Marie-André and Elise, to include at least 3 other staff members who figured out what's happening and chosen to participate in their own ways. Dr. Petit, a Belgian physician who works in the recovery ward, has begun prescribing suspiciously ineffective antibiotic regimens for German patients while ensuring Belgian civilians receive optimal treatment protocols. A laboratory technician named Franz has started reporting false negative results on bacterial cultures from German patients, delaying proper antibiotic selection by days or weeks while infections establish themselves beyond easy treatment. An older nun, Sister Therese, who manages the pharmacy, has developed a habit of providing medications to German patients that are suspiciously close to their expiration dates, or have been stored in conditions that reduce their potency. None of these people have ever discussed their actions explicitly with each other. They operate through a kind of silent coordination, watching each other's patterns, adjusting their own contributions to complement what others are doing, creating a distributed resistance network that has no formal structure and therefore no single point of failure. If one person is caught, the others can plausibly deny knowledge or coordination. This organic resistance cell has developed its own unspoken protocols and safety measures entirely through observation and careful inference, a testament to how desperate people under occupation learn to communicate through actions rather than words. The increasing sophistication of Sister Marie-André's sabotage techniques by late 1944 reflects both her growing expertise and the escalating stakes as the war approaches its conclusion. She's learned to target not just individual soldiers, but entire categories of patients whose disability will have cascading effects on German military capability. Pilots and tank commanders receive her most aggressive contamination because their specialized training makes them difficult to replace, and their loss degrades complex military systems. Communication specialists and engineers get special attention because their technical knowledge is crucial to maintaining German defensive positions. She's developed an informal classification system for patients based on intelligence she gathers by listening to conversations in the wards, categorizing men by their unit, specialization, and likelihood of returning to combat-effective service. High-value targets receive instruments that have been deliberately contaminated with particularly virulent bacterial strains that she's learned to culture in conditions that look like simple negligence. Medium-value targets get standard contamination protocols. Low-value targets, administrative staff and support personnel who will never see combat, sometimes receive properly sterilized instruments because disabling them provides no meaningful military advantage, and the risk of pattern detection isn't worth the minimal gain. She's transformed medical sabotage into a calculated science, complete with target prioritization and resource allocation strategies that would be impressive in their sophistication if they weren't so morally terrifying in their implications. The personal cost of her sustained resistance campaign manifests in ways both physical and psychological as the months stretch into years. Sister Marie-André has aged dramatically since she began her sabotage operation, her face drawn and pale, her hands developing a tremor during off-duty hours that she has to consciously suppress when working. She sleeps poorly, averaging 3 or 4 hours a night, her rest interrupted by dreams that mix surgical procedures with confessionals, where she's simultaneously performing operations and seeking absolution for sins she's not sure she's actually committed. Her relationship with faith has become complicated in ways she never anticipated when she first took her vows. She still prays every day, still attends Mass, still performs all the outward rituals of religious life, but the content of her prayers has shifted from supplication to negotiation, from asking God for guidance to informing him of decisions she's already made and daring him to judge her for them. She's developed a private theology that exists parallel to official church doctrine, a belief system that holds that divine love sometimes requires human beings to commit acts that look like sins but are actually forms of protection, that mercy toward evil enables evil, and that true compassion sometimes wears the face of calculated harm. Whether this theology will sustain her soul in the long term remains an open question, but in the immediate present of 1944, with liberation finally approaching but the occupation's cruelty intensifying in its final months, it's the only framework that allows her to continue functioning as both a woman of God and a woman at war. The autumn of 1944 brings a new and terrifying complication to Sister Marie-André's operation when the Gestapo establishes a permanent presence in the hospital, not as patients, but as investigators. A Sturmbannführer named Klaus Richter arrives with 2 assistants and announces that he's conducting a security review of all medical facilities in the region following reports of sabotage at military hospitals across occupied Belgium. Richter is not a doctor, not a medical administrator, but a counterintelligence specialist whose entire career has been built on identifying and eliminating resistance networks. He's methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who understands that patterns reveal themselves over time rather than through dramatic interrogations. He sets up an office in what used to be the hospital's administrative suite and begins a systematic review of every aspect of the facility's operations, from supply chains to staffing records to patient outcomes. Sister Marie-André learns of his presence through the hospital grapevine before she ever sees him, and the news hits her like a physical blow. For the first time since she began her campaign, she faces an adversary who's actually looking for what she's doing, who has the training and authority to recognize sabotage patterns that medical administrators would miss, who won't be satisfied with explanations about wartime conditions and equipment failures. The invisible war she's been fighting is about to become significantly more dangerous. Richter's investigation methodology is sophisticated in ways that exploit the very silence and compartmentalization that have protected Sister Marie-André's network until now. He doesn't announce what he's looking for or share his theories about what might be happening. Instead, he observes, takes notes, asks seemingly innocuous questions about procedures and protocols, and cross-references patient outcomes with staff assignments to identify statistical anomalies. He requisitions records going back 2 years and builds spreadsheets tracking infection rates by surgeon, by nurse, by shift, by patient nationality, by procedure type, creating a data matrix that slowly reveals patterns invisible to casual observation. Sister Marie-André knows about this analysis because she's been asked to provide some of the records he's requested, and what she sees in his organized files terrifies her. He's approaching the problem exactly the way someone would need to approach it to discover what she's been doing, methodically eliminating variables until only human agency remains as an explanation. She calculates that she has perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at most, before his analysis produces results specific enough to identify her or one of her silent collaborators. The question becomes whether to stop her sabotage immediately, hoping that a sudden return to normal infection rates won't itself be suspicious, or to continue operating while preparing for the likelihood of exposure and its lethal consequences. The decision to continue her sabotage despite Richter's investigation reflects both Sister Marie-André's commitment to resistance and her realistic assessment of her options. If she stops now, the sudden change in infection patterns will itself be a red flag to an investigator as sophisticated as Richter, potentially accelerating his investigation rather than deflecting it. If she continues but reduces the frequency of contamination, she might extend the time before detection, but at the cost of reducing her impact during what might be the final months of the war. If she continues at current intensity, she maximizes her contribution to the resistance, but almost certainly guarantees eventual exposure. She chooses the third option, not out of fatalism, but out of calculation. The Allied advance is accelerating. Liberation could come within months, possibly weeks, if the military situation continues to deteriorate for Germany. Every additional soldier she disables, every extra week that combat-effective troops spend in hospital beds, potentially saves Belgian lives and accelerates the occupation's end. Her survival matters less than the mission's completion, and the mission can only be completed by continuing the sabotage for as long as physically possible. She makes this decision alone in her room during the small hours of the morning, praying not for protection, but for the courage to face whatever consequences her choice brings. By dawn, her resolve has crystallized into something harder than fear, the certainty that some prices are worth paying. The cat-and-mouse dynamic that develops between Sister Marie-André and Richter over the following weeks has an almost theatrical quality. Two professionals operating at the highest level of their respective crafts, with life and death stakes. Richter begins attending surgical procedures as an observer, standing in the corner of operating theaters taking notes, his presence creating a tension that affects everyone's performance. Sister Marie-André knows he's watching specifically for anomalies in how instruments are prepared and handled, so she performs her duties during these observed procedures with absolute textbook precision. But she also knows he can't observe every surgery, can't be present for every sterilization cycle, can't monitor the hospital 24 hours a day. She adjusts her tactics, concentrating her sabotage during night shifts when Richter is absent, selecting lower-profile cases that won't attract immediate attention spreading her contamination across a wider range of procedures to make the pattern less obvious. She's playing for time, trying to maintain her impact while evading detection long enough for liberation to arrive. Richter, for his part, seems to sense that he's close to something significant even if he can't quite identify what or who. His questions become more pointed, his observation more focused, his statistical analysis more refined. He begins pulling individual staff members aside for informal conversations, asking about their backgrounds, their families, their opinions on the occupation, fishing for the kinds of details that might reveal ideological motivations for resistance. Sister Marie-Andre endures one of these conversations, sitting across from him in his temporary office, while he asks about her nursing training, her religious vocation, her observations about the hospital's unusual infection rates. She answers every question with careful honesty about verifiable facts, while offering explanations for patterns that sound plausible without actually being true. And she walks out of that interview knowing that she's now on his short list of suspects, even if he doesn't yet have proof. The psychological strain of operating under direct surveillance while maintaining the appearance of normalcy pushes Sister Marie-Andre to the edge of her capacity for sustained deception. Every movement in the sterilization room now carries the weight of potential observation, even when she's physically alone, because she knows Richter could walk in at any moment or could have arranged for someone else to watch without her knowledge. The natural rhythm of her work becomes self-conscious and artificial as she constantly monitors her own actions, checking whether anything she's doing could be interpreted as suspicious, creating elaborate mental explanations for even routine procedures in case she's questioned about them later. The paranoia isn't irrational, it's a necessary adaptation to genuinely dangerous circumstances, but it's also exhausting in ways that her initial sabotage campaign never was. She begins making small mistakes in her legitimate nursing duties, nothing dangerous but enough to be noticeable. Her concentration fractured by the constant need to maintain multiple levels of awareness. Other staff members notice her strain, and some of them, particularly Elise and Dr. Petit, who share her secret resistance, try to provide cover by taking on additional responsibilities that reduce her workload. But this redistribution of duties itself creates new patterns that a sophisticated observer like Richter might notice, and Sister Marie-Andre finds herself caught in an impossible position where both action and inaction carry risk, where every choice could be the one that finally exposes the network that has operated in shadows for nearly 2 years. As October turns to November, and the sound of Allied artillery becomes audible in the distance on quiet nights, she understands that the race between liberation and discovery has entered its final phase, and that the outcome will determine not just her fate, but the fates of everyone who has participated in this most intimate form of warfare. The crisis that finally brings Sister Marie-Andre's operation into direct confrontation with Richter's investigation arrives on a cold morning in early November 1944, when a high-ranking SS officer named Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Krause is brought into the hospital with life-threatening injuries from a partisan ambush. Krause is not just any officer. He's the regional security commander responsible for anti-resistance operations across the entire province, a man whose signature appears on execution orders for hundreds of Belgian civilians, whose interrogation methods are legendary for their brutality. His survival is a strategic priority for the German occupation apparatus, and his death would be a significant blow to their ability to suppress resistance in the region's final months. The surgery to save his life is assigned to Dr. Hoffmann, with Sister Marie-Andre as his primary surgical nurse, a pairing that reflects their reputation as the hospital's most skilled team. The operating theatre fills with armed guards, Gestapo observers and medical officers from the regional command, all of them acutely aware that Krause's death on the table would trigger investigations and reprisals that could consume the entire staff. Sister Marie-Andre understands immediately that this surgery represents both her greatest opportunity and her most dangerous moment. The instruments she prepares for this operation will either save the life of a mass murderer or introduce an infection that could kill him slowly while appearing entirely natural. But the scrutiny surrounding this particular patient means that any suspicious outcome will receive the kind of forensic attention that could unravel her entire network. The decision she makes in the sterilization room that morning, alone with the instruments that will cut into Krause's body, defines everything she's been building toward for 2 years. Every rational calculation argues for caution. This surgery has too many observers, too much political importance, too much potential for detailed investigation if anything goes wrong. Contaminating these instruments isn't just risky, it's nearly suicidal. The kind of action that could expose not just herself, but everyone who has participated in her network of silent resistance. But Sister Marie-Andre has spent 2 years watching men like Krause brutalize her country while hiding behind the protection of military hospitals, has spent countless hours healing soldiers who return to commit atrocities, has compromised her vows and her soul in service of a resistance that only matters if it targets exactly these kinds of high-value killers. If she retreats to safety now when the opportunity is greatest, then everything she's done becomes meaningless. A collection of small victories that avoided the defining battle. She holds Krause's surgical tray in her hands, looking at the scalpels and retractors that will save his life if properly sterilized or doom him if contaminated, and she makes the choice that has been inevitable since the moment she started down this path. The instruments go through her abbreviated sterilization protocol, the one that leaves bacterial spores alive in microscopic crevices, the one she's perfected over months of practice. When she delivers the tray to the operating theater, her hands are steady, and her face shows nothing but professional concern. She's chosen warfare over safety, impact over survival, and she's committed to seeing this decision through to whatever end it brings. The surgery itself lasts 7 hours, a marathon procedure that requires removing shrapnel from Krause's abdomen, repairing damage to his liver and intestines, and reconstructing blood vessels that were shredded by the partisans' bullets. Dr. Hoffman works with absolute concentration, his skilled hands moving through anatomical spaces with the precision that comes from decades of surgical experience. Sister Marie-Andre assists him with her usual efficiency, anticipating his needs, providing instruments before he asks, maintaining the sterile field, doing everything a perfect surgical nurse should do. The contaminated instruments pass through her hands into his, then into Krause's body, opening and cutting and suturing with no visible indication that they're carrying microscopic passengers that will, if her sabotage succeeds, transform this successful surgery into a delayed execution. The guards and observers watch the entire procedure with tense attention, but they're looking for obvious sabotage. For a nurse who drops an instrument, or a surgeon who makes a suspicious error, they see nothing remotely questionable. What they see is skilled medical professionals working at the height of their abilities to save a life. Exactly what they expect to see. Exactly what Sister Marie-Andre has trained them to expect. When Hoffman completes the final sutures and announces that the surgery was successful, that Krause will survive his injuries, there's a collective exhale of relief in the room. Sister Marie-Andre helps clean and close, her face showing appropriate satisfaction at a difficult surgery completed successfully, while internally she's beginning the waiting game that will determine whether her sabotage produces the infection she's introduced, or whether some combination of Krause's immune system and antibiotic treatment will overcome the contamination. Richter's response to Krause's surgery reveals just how sophisticated and dangerous his investigation has become. He doesn't celebrate the successful procedure or relax his scrutiny. Instead, he immediately intensifies his monitoring of Krause's recovery, installing observers in the recovery ward with instructions to document every detail of post-operative care, every medication administered, every change in the patient's condition. He requisitions Krause's medical records going forward, instructing staff that he wants real-time reports on temperature, white blood cell counts, wound appearance, anything that might indicate complications. Sister Marie-Andre realizes with cold clarity that Richter suspects something might be wrong even before any symptoms appear, that he's treating Krause's recovery as a potential crime scene, preparing to gather evidence from the first moment of infection if infection occurs. This level of preparation suggests that Richter has identified the pattern she's been creating, has recognized that important German patients in this hospital develop infections at suspicious rates, and has decided to use Kraus as bait to catch whoever is responsible. The surgery wasn't just a medical procedure, it was a trap. And Sister Marie-André has walked directly into it by choosing to sabotage the most heavily monitored operation in the hospital's history. She understands now that whether Kraus lives or dies, whether the infection develops or not, Richter's investigation is about to reach its conclusion, and that conclusion will almost certainly involve her exposure and execution. The first signs of infection appear 4 days after surgery, initially subtle but progressively unmistakable to anyone who knows what to look for. Kraus's temperature rises slightly above normal. His white blood cell count begins climbing. The surgical wound shows early signs of inflammation that exceed normal post-operative healing. Dr. Hoffman adjusts antibiotic dosages, increases monitoring frequency, and maintains outward confidence that these are manageable complications. But Sister Marie-André can see the concern in his eyes, can hear the conversations he has with other German medical officers about the unexpected turn in Kraus's recovery. By day 6, the infection is undeniable, aggressive, spreading despite antibiotic treatment that should be effective. Kraus develops fever. His wound begins producing purulent discharge. His recovery reverses into a struggle for survival that dominates the entire hospital's attention. Richter observes all of this with an expression that Sister Marie-André can only describe as grimly satisfied, like a hunter who has finally confirmed that the prey he's been tracking actually exists. He begins pulling staff members in for more formal interrogations, no longer casual conversations, but structured interviews with stenographers recording every word. The net is closing, and everyone in the hospital can feel it. Sister Marie-André knows her time is measured in days now, perhaps hours. The infection she introduced into Oberfuhrer Kraus's body is the evidence that will condemn her, the proof that Richter has been looking for, the culmination of a resistance campaign that is about to claim its final and most dangerous victory at the cost of everything she has left to lose. The interrogation that seals Sister Marie-André's fate begins on the 8th day after Kraus's surgery, when his condition has deteriorated to the point where even aggressive medical intervention seems unlikely to save him. Richter summons her to his office at 10 in the morning, a time deliberately chosen to maximize the psychological impact, early enough that the entire day stretches ahead with uncertainty, but late enough that she's had hours to anticipate the confrontation. When she enters the room, she finds not just Richter but 2 other Gestapo officers, a stenographer, and a table covered with documents and charts that she recognizes as statistical analyses of the hospital's infection patterns over the past 2 years. Richter doesn't waste time with pleasantries or indirect questioning. He begins by showing her graphs that track infection rates correlated with her shift assignments, demonstrating a statistically impossible correlation between her presence in the sterilization room and subsequent patient complications. He presents testimony from staff members who've noticed her unusual focus on which instruments go to which patients, though none of them understood the significance until questioned directly. He walks her through the timeline of Kraus's surgery, pointing out that she was alone with the instruments for 7 minutes before the procedure began. 7 minutes with no witnesses and no supervision. The evidence is circumstantial but overwhelming in its cumulative weight, and Sister Marie-André understands that denial would be both pointless and undignified. When Richter finally pauses and asks her directly if she has been deliberately contaminating surgical instruments to cause infections in German military patients, she meets his eyes and says yes without hesitation or apology, her voice steady and clear, transforming confession into accusation by refusing to treat her actions as crimes rather than acts of war. The hours that follow her confession blur together into a nightmare of documentation and procedure, as the Gestapo apparatus processes her from suspect to convicted saboteur with bureaucratic efficiency. She's photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to a formal interrogation designed to identify other members of her network and document the full extent of her activities. Richter wants names, wants to know who else has been involved, wants to dismantle the entire resistance cell that he correctly suspects exists within the hospital. Sister Marie-André provides detailed information about her own actions, describes her methods and techniques with almost clinical precision, but refuses to implicate anyone else regardless of the threats and pressures brought to bear. She insists that she worked alone, that no one else knew what she was doing, that any patterns suggesting coordination are simply coincidences produced by the general chaos of wartime medical care. It's a transparent lie that Richter clearly doesn't believe, but it's also a lie that protects Elise and Dr. Petit and Sister Therese and Franz, buying them time to adjust their own behaviors and create distance from the exposure that's consuming Sister Marie-André. The interrogation becomes a battle of wills between an investigator who demands complete disclosure and a prisoner who will provide everything except the information that would harm others. By evening, Richter seems to recognize that further questioning will produce nothing useful, and the interrogation shifts from information gathering to formal charges and procedures for military tribunal. The trial, if it can even be called that, occurs within 48 hours of her confession, in a makeshift courtroom established in the hospital's administrative wing. The proceedings are perfunctory, a bureaucratic formality required before execution, rather than any genuine effort to establish guilt or innocence. A German military judge presides over a panel that includes Richter and 2 other officers, while Sister Marie-André stands before them without legal representation or any meaningful opportunity to present a defense. The charges are read in German and translated into French. Sabotage of military medical facilities, acts of terrorism against wounded soldiers, conspiracy to commit murder, violations of the Geneva Convention's protections for medical personnel. The evidence is presented through Richter's written report and supporting documentation, the statistical analyses and witness statements compiled during his investigation. Sister Marie-André is given an opportunity to speak, and she uses it not to plead for mercy, but to explain why she did what she did, to describe the moral impossibility of healing men who would return to brutalizing her country, to argue that medical neutrality becomes collaboration when applied to an occupying force. Her statement lasts perhaps 10 minutes, delivered in calm, measured tones that treat the court not as judges, but as fellow participants in a war where different sides have different rules. The verdict is predetermined, delivered within minutes of the trial's conclusion: guilty on all charges, sentence of death by firing squad to be carried out within 72 hours. The judge announces the verdict without drama or emotion, just another administrative task, completed in a day full of administrative tasks, and Sister Marie-André is escorted back to a cell that has been prepared in the hospital's basement to await her execution. The final 2 days of Sister Marie-André's life unfold in a strange, suspended reality, where normal time seems to have stopped, while she waits for the end she's known was coming since the moment she contaminated her first instrument. She's kept in isolation, permitted no visitors except for a German military chaplain who comes to offer spiritual counsel that she politely but firmly declines. She can hear the normal sounds of the hospital continuing above her, surgeries being performed, patients recovering or dying, the machinery of wartime medicine grinding forward as if her removal from it matters not at all. In some ways, that continuation is exactly what she wanted. Proof that her actions were about the work itself, rather than about any individual importance. The resistance she represented will continue in other forms, through other people, in ways that don't depend on her survival. But the isolation also provides time for reflection that she's avoided during 2 years of constant action. Space, to consider not just what she did, but what it cost who she became, whether the transformation from healer to killer serves any purpose beyond satisfying her own need to fight back. She prays during these final hours, not the bargaining prayers of someone seeking rescue, but the accounting prayers of someone preparing to meet whatever judgment waits beyond death. She asks not for forgiveness, but for understanding, not for salvation, but for acknowledgement that the choices she made were impossible choices, where all options carried unbearable costs, that she did what seemed necessary in circumstances where necessity wore the face of evil. Whether God or history will ultimately judge her actions as justified remains unknowable. But in the basement cell where she awaits execution, Sister Marie-André finds a kind of peace in accepting that some questions don't have answers available to the living. The morning of her execution arrives with the false normalcy of any other day, sunlight filtering through the small window of her cell, the sounds of the hospital waking to another shift of treating wounds and managing pain. The guards come for her at dawn, not cruel but not gentle either. Professionals performing an unpleasant duty they've performed many times before. She's escorted through corridors she knows intimately to a courtyard behind the hospital that has been prepared as an execution ground, a brick wall at one end and a wooden post where condemned prisoners are tied. A small group of witnesses has assembled, German military officers required to observe, hospital staff compelled to watch as a warning against resistance, and Richter himself standing at the edge of the gathering with an expression that might be satisfaction or might be something more complicated. Sister Marie-André walks to the post without resistance, without final statements, without the dramatic gestures that might reduce her death to theatre. She's offered a blindfold and accepts it, offered a final prayer and declines it. The firing squad assembles, young soldiers who avoid looking at her directly, who focus on their rifles and their orders, rather than on the woman in the nun's habit tied to the post. In her final moment before the shots ring out, Sister Marie-André thinks not of eternity or salvation, but of Oberfuhrer Krauser dying slowly in a hospital bed 3 floors above, his body consumed by the infection she introduced, and she decides that if this is the cost of that one death, of all the deaths her sabotage caused, then it's a price she's willing to pay. The rifles fire in a ragged volley that ends her life instantly, and the woman who transformed healing into warfare, who made herself a weapon in the most intimate possible way, becomes one more unmarked casualty in a war full of casualties whose stories will never be properly told. The execution of Sister Marie-André creates a silence in the hospital that feels more oppressive than any sound, a collective holding of breath as staff members process what has just happened and what it means for their own survival. The German authorities make no official announcement about why she was executed, offering only vague references to security violations and acts of sabotage. But everyone understands the essential truth. A nurse who was supposed to heal has been killed for choosing to harm, and the message implicit in her death is that collaboration is the only safe position, that resistance of any kind invites destruction. Elise stops coming to work the day after the execution, simply vanishes without explanation, and later rumors suggest she fled into the countryside to join partisan groups operating in the forests. Dr. Petit continues his duties but becomes almost robotically cautious, treating all patients with identical care, eliminating any trace of the preferential protocols he'd been quietly implementing. Sister Therese ages visibly over the following weeks, her hands shaking when she distributes medications, her eyes haunted by survivors' guilt and the knowledge that her own small acts of resistance contributed to a campaign that ended at an execution wall. The network that operated through silent coordination has been shattered not just by Sister Marie-André's death, but by the fear that anyone else identified as part of her operation will face the same fate. Richter remains in the hospital for another month, observing, documenting, clearly hoping to identify other conspirators, but the infection rates return to normal almost immediately after Sister Marie-André's execution, not because the sabotage has stopped, but because it never extended beyond her actions in the sterilization room, and the support roles others played were too subtle to continue without her central coordination. Oberfuhrer Krauser dies 11 days after Sister Marie-André's execution, his body finally succumbing to the infection that spread despite every medical intervention the German command could marshal. His death receives extensive documentation and investigation, but the conclusion is that he was a victim of wartime medical conditions, contaminated instruments that were inadequately sterilized due to equipment failures and overwhelming patient loads. Sister Marie-André's confession mentioned Kraus specifically, but without her alive to provide details, without physical evidence of deliberate contamination, and with the instruments long since destroyed through normal disposal procedures, the case against her remains circumstantial enough that German authorities can frame his death as a tragic consequence of war rather than as a successful act of assassination. This official narrative serves multiple purposes for the occupation administration. It avoids admitting that their security apparatus failed to prevent a nun from conducting a 2-year sabotage campaign under their noses. It prevents the story from inspiring copycat resistance in other medical facilities, and it allows them to maintain the fiction that hospitals remain neutral spaces protected from the war's violence. The truth that Sister Marie-André killed Kraus as surely as if she'd shot him herself gets buried under layers of bureaucratic language and strategic omission, transforming her final and greatest act of resistance into an unfortunate medical complication in official records. The liberation of Belgium comes less than 2 months after Sister Marie-André's execution, Allied forces entering the city where her hospital stands in early January 1945 amid chaotic German retreat and jubilant civilian celebration. The hospital transitions almost overnight from German military control to Allied occupation, with American and British medical personnel arriving to assess facilities and treat both liberated prisoners and German wounded who've been abandoned during the withdrawal. Among the staff who remained to help with this transition is Dr. Hoffmann, the German surgeon who worked alongside Sister Marie-André for years without ever suspecting her sabotage. In conversations with Allied investigators documenting war crimes and resistance activities, Hoffmann mentions the nurse who was executed for medical sabotage, describes her skill and dedication, expresses genuine confusion about how someone so committed to healing could have deliberately caused harm. His testimony, combined with records seized from Richter's files, provides Allied intelligence with a partial picture of Sister Marie-André's campaign, though the full extent of her network and impact remains obscure because the key witnesses are dead, missing, or unwilling to discuss their roles. The official Allied report on resistance activities in Belgian hospitals mentions her case briefly, noting it as an example of medical sabotage, but without understanding the sophistication or duration of her operation, treating it as a footnote rather than as a significant contribution to resistance efforts. The physical evidence of Sister Marie-André's existence begins disappearing almost immediately after liberation, not through deliberate destruction, but through the normal chaos of war's aftermath and institutional memory's failure. The small room where she lived in the convent section of the hospital gets reassigned to another nurse, her few possessions distributed or discarded without ceremony. The sterilization room where she conducted her warfare for 2 years is renovated and modernized by Allied medical teams, the old equipment she manipulated replaced with newer systems, eliminating any traces of her methods. The execution wall in the courtyard behind the hospital gets demolished during post-war reconstruction, the bricks scattered and repurposed for other projects, erasing the physical site of her death. Hospital records from the occupation period, including the statistical analyses that Richter compiled documenting infection patterns, are classified as intelligence materials and shipped to archives in Britain and America, where they'll remain inaccessible to researchers for decades. The people who knew her story, who witnessed her trial and execution, scatter to different lives in liberated Europe, carrying memories that will fade with time and that they have little incentive to share because collaboration and resistance exist on a spectrum that post-war society prefers not to examine too carefully. Within 5 years of liberation, asking hospital staff about the nun who was executed will produce mostly blank stares, a few vague recollections, and no coherent narrative of what she actually did or why it mattered. The broader historical amnesia that consumes Sister Marie-André's story reflects larger patterns in how societies remember wartime resistance and how individual acts of courage get lost in narratives that prefer collective struggle over personal moral complexity. Post-war Belgium celebrates partisan fighters and underground networks, commemorates saboteurs who blew up trains and assassinated collaborators, builds monuments to resistance that fits heroic templates of armed struggle and dramatic sacrifice. Medical sabotage conducted by nuns doesn't fit these narratives easily. It's too subtle, too morally ambiguous, too uncomfortable in its implications about what healing professions might become under occupation. The fact that Sister Marie-André killed through infection rather than bullets, that she used instruments of mercy as weapons of war, that she violated every principle of medical neutrality while claiming to serve higher moral imperatives, creates a story that resists easy commemoration. Veterans organizations don't know how to honor a nurse who deliberately caused suffering. Medical professional associations can't celebrate someone who betrayed fundamental healthcare ethics, even in service of resistance. Religious institutions struggle with a nun who used her vows as cover for killing, and who went to her execution without seeking absolution for actions she considered justified. So her story simply falls through the cracks of collective memory, remembered vaguely if at all, reduced to an uncomfortable anecdote that historians occasionally reference without fully engaging, a resistance campaign that succeeded in its immediate tactical goals, but failed to secure its own place in the history it helped shape. The rediscovery of Sister Marie André's story doesn't happen through dramatic archival revelation or investigative journalism breakthrough, but through the slow accumulation of fragmentary evidence that only gains meaning when assembled decades after the events themselves. In the 1990s, a Belgian graduate student researching medical care during occupation stumbles across Richter's statistical reports in a declassified intelligence archive in London, documents that show inexplicable infection patterns at a specific hospital during 1943 and 44. Cross-referencing these statistics with German military tribunal records reveals the execution of an unnamed nun for medical sabotage, though the files provide few details about her methods or identity. Hospital employment records from the occupation period, discovered in a church basement during renovations in 2003, list several nuns who worked as nurses, but without photographs or detailed biographical information. Connecting any specific individual to the sabotage case proves impossible. Testimony from elderly Belgians who worked at the hospital during the war, collected through oral history projects, provides pieces of the story, but filtered through 80 years of fading memory and the natural human tendency to reshape difficult truths into more comfortable narratives. What emerges from this fragmentary evidence is not a complete biography but a ghost story, the outline of a woman whose name might have been Marie André, or might have been something else entirely, who transformed hospital sterilization into biological warfare, who killed dozens of enemy soldiers through deliberate infection, and who was executed for crimes that were simultaneously war atrocities and acts of resistance depending on which moral furrow. Framework 1 applies. The ethical questions raised by Sister Marie André's campaign remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, touching on fundamental tensions between professional ethics and wartime necessity that have no clear answers. Medical neutrality, as codified in the Geneva Conventions and professional codes of conduct, exists specifically to create spaces where healing can occur regardless of politics or nationality, where even enemies can trust that healthcare providers will act in their patients' best interests. Sister Marie André's actions violated this principle absolutely, transforming hospitals from protected neutral zones into battlefields where care itself became weaponized. From one perspective, her sabotage was a profound betrayal of everything medical practice represents, a perversion of the healer's vocation that justified her execution and that should serve as a warning against allowing political considerations to corrupt professional judgment. From another perspective, demanding medical neutrality during occupation means demanding that healthcare workers collaborate in perpetuating atrocity, that they use their skills to repair the machinery of oppression, that they prioritize abstract professional ethics over concrete human suffering. The tension between these perspectives cannot be resolved through logical argument because they rest on fundamentally different premises about what obligations medical professionals have during wartime and whether healing the oppressor constitutes a form of collaboration that justifies otherwise unthinkable actions. What makes Sister Marie André's story particularly significant for contemporary understanding of resistance is how it illustrates that warfare during occupation operates across multiple dimensions simultaneously, that armed partisan struggle represents only one form of fighting back, and that some of the most effective resistance happens in spaces and through methods that are invisible to conventional military history. She never fired a weapon, never planted a bomb, never engaged in direct combat, yet her campaign potentially removed more German soldiers from combat effectiveness than many armed resistance cells achieved through months of dangerous operations. By operating within systems that the occupation relied upon and trusted, by exploiting the very protections and assumptions that made hospitals function, she created a form of sabotage that was nearly impossible to detect and extraordinarily difficult to counter once discovered. Her methods required no weapons, no training in explosives or tactics, no coordination with external resistance networks. They required only detailed knowledge of her profession, access to hospital facilities, and the moral courage to transform healing into harm. This kind of resistance, conducted by individuals embedded in institutional structures that serve occupying forces, represents a dimension of wartime opposition that historians have traditionally overlooked because it doesn't fit heroic narratives and because its practitioners often died without their stories being documented or understood. The contemporary relevance of Sister Marie-André's story extends beyond historical curiosity to raise urgent questions about collaboration and resistance in authoritarian contexts, about what obligations professionals have when their expertise can be weaponized, about the moral status of actions that violate ethical norms in service of resisting oppression. Healthcare workers in occupied territories today, doctors treating wounded soldiers from invading forces, nurses working in facilities controlled by authoritarian regimes, face dilemmas structurally identical to those Sister Marie-André confronted in 1943. The question of whether medical neutrality remains obligatory when treating representatives of occupying powers has no consensus answer among ethicists and continues to generate passionate debate within medical professional organizations. Her story forces consideration of whether there are circumstances where the Hippocratic principle of doing no harm must be subordinated to larger moral imperatives, where the individual patient's welfare matters less than collective resistance to oppression, where professional ethics and human conscience come into irreconcilable conflict. These are not comfortable questions, and Sister Marie-André's actions provide no comfortable answers, only the historical fact that at least one person concluded that healing the enemy was collaboration and chose sabotage over neutrality, accepting execution as the price of that choice. The ultimate legacy of the nun whose name might have been Marie-André exists not in monuments or official recognition, but in the uncomfortable truths her story forces us to confront about resistance, collaboration, and the moral complexity of life under occupation. She reminds us that heroes don't always look heroic, that effective resistance sometimes wears the face of betrayal, that the line between healing and harming can collapse under the pressure of impossible circumstances. Her campaign of deliberate infection saved lives by taking lives, protected the innocent by harming the guilty, upheld higher principles by violating sacred professional ethics. Whether history should celebrate her as a resistance hero or condemn her as a war criminal remains an open question, one that each person must answer based on their own moral framework and their own assessment of what obligations survive when normal society collapses into occupation and atrocity. What's undeniable is that she fought back using the only weapons available to her, that she accepted the consequences of her choices without flinching, and that she disappeared into historical obscurity not because her actions lacked impact, but because they embodied contradictions too profound for comfortable commemoration. In the sterile rooms of that Belgian hospital, in the quiet moments when she contaminated instruments that would carry infection into enemy bodies, Sister Marie-André waged a war that history has tried to forget, but that continues to haunt anyone who seriously considers what resistance means, when the only battlefield available is the space between healing and harm, between mercy and justice, between the vows that define us and the choices that see. Revival demands